My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm 28 years old, and my story begins on the day I realized my grandfather wasn't the man any of us believed him to be. We were cleaning out his farmhouse after the funeral, dust clinging to every box and drawer, when I pulled open a desk that hadn't been touched in years. Something shifted inside the back panel, a sound sharp enough to freeze me in place. With trembling hands, I slid it open, and what I found changed everything I thought I knew about my family. White right pointing backhand index before I share what happened next. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. I remember the smell of that room first. Old wood and stale tobacco, faintly mixed with the lavender sachets my grandmother used to hide in every drawer. The desk stood in the corner, scratched and tired, but still stubbornly holding its shape like it had been waiting for us to notice it. My mom wanted to throw it out without looking inside. Too heavy to keep, she said, but I insisted. Something about it felt unfinished. As I tugged the drawers, one by one, I found nothing but scraps, dull pencils, a rusted paperclip, faded receipts from grocery stores that no longer existed. But when I reached the bottom drawer, it jammed halfway out. I gave it a hard pull, and something shifted, a hollow thud, like wood against wood. That was when I saw it. A thin seam in the back panel, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Claire? What's taking so long? My brother, Michael, called from the hallway. Just hold on a minute, I muttered, sliding my nails along the edge until it gave way. The panel popped loose with a soft snap. Behind it, pressed flat against the wood, was a yellowed envelope. I froze. It wasn't addressed to anyone living. The ink, though faded, spelled out a name I'd seen in yearbooks, in family albums, in birthday cards signed with shaky hands. To Thomas Mitchell, my grandfather. Did you find something? Mum stepped into the doorway, her arms folded, her eyes tired from days of tears. I think so, I whispered, holding the envelope like it might break if I squeezed too hard. We gathered at the kitchen table. Michael leaned in, his elbow bumping the salt shaker, and Mom reached for a tissue like she already knew whatever was inside would cut deep. The paper felt brittle under my fingers, each corner curled inward like it had been hiding for decades. I slit it open carefully, unfolding the single page within. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost desperate, and the first word sent a chill racing down my spine. Tom, if you are reading this, it means I never had the chance to say goodbye. The silence in the room was so heavy I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. Who is it from? Michael asked, his voice low, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. I shook my head. The letter wasn't signed, at least not at the beginning, but the way it was written, personal, almost pleading, made it clear this wasn't just a casual note. This was a confession. The writer spoke of long nights overseas, of promises whispered in the dark, of a bond formed during the war that no one else could ever understand. My grandfather's name appeared again and again, tangled in words like secret, loyalty, and betrayal. Mom's hand trembled as she reached for the page. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice breaking. Your grandfather he never mentioned anything like this. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My grandfather had been the steady one, the man who fixed fence posts with his bare hands, who taught us how to fish, who never raised his voice. To imagine him tangled in some secret, some hidden relationship or unfinished chapter of his life, it didn't fit. And yet, here it was, proof in faded ink. I read further. The letter spoke of a name, not my grandmother's, not anyone we knew. Just a single line, if they ever ask about Daniel, tell them the truth, Tom. Don't let them carry the weight of our silence. My throat tightened. Daniel. Michael repeated. He frowned, scanning the words over my shoulder. Do we even know a Daniel? Mom's face drained of color. No, she whispered, though it sounded more like a question than an answer. The three of us sat in silence, the letter spread out like evidence at a crime scene. The farmhouse walls seemed to close in, the air thick with secrets we hadn't asked for. I wanted to ask my grandfather, to demand answers, but he was gone. All we had left was this piece of paper, this strange name, and a sinking feeling that our family wasn't what we thought it was. Maybe it's nothing, Michael said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe it's just a war buddy. Oh. But even as he trailed off, he knew it wasn't that simple. None of us believed it was. I folded the letter back into the envelope, my hands clammy, my mind racing. Who was Daniel? Why would my grandfather keep this hidden? And what truth had he carried to his grave? That night, long after my mom and Michael had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the envelope resting beside my coffee cup. The house creaked around me, old floorboards shifting under the weight of unanswered questions. I kept rereading the same lines, hoping they'd rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they never did. By midnight, I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever the letter meant, it wasn't just about my grandfather's past. It was about us, his family, and the truth we had inherited without knowing. And I wasn't sure we were ready for it. The letter sat beside my coffee cup, its edges cold and fragile, as though it might crumble into dust if I touched it one more time. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the old pipes, and in that silence, one name echoed over and over in my mind. Daniel. I whispered it under my breath, testing how it felt on my tongue. Daniel. A stranger's name, somehow tied to my grandfather's hidden life. I reached for the envelope again, holding it under the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, my fingers tracing the faded handwriting. The words carried weight, a quiet urgency that left no doubt this Daniel wasn't just a passing acquaintance. Whoever he was, my grandfather had carried him in silence for decades. My thoughts spun wildly. Was Daniel a friend? A brother in arms? A man who had saved my grandfather's life? Or someone darker? Someone tied to betrayal and secrets? I couldn't sleep. By 2 a.m, I was pacing the kitchen, my bare feet pressing against the cold linoleum. Questions clawed at me until I finally gave in. I pulled my phone from the counter and searched our family records online, half hoping, half dreading what I might find. The search results offered nothing. No Daniels listed in our family tree, no distant cousins or forgotten uncles. My grandfather had siblings, yes, but their names were Henry, Charles, and Margaret. Not Daniel. I scrolled through obituary archives, marriage records, even old census documents, my eyes stinging from the screen's glow. Still, nothing. It was as if Daniel didn't exist at all. I was startled when I heard footsteps creak down the hallway. My mom appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her worn robe, her hair messy from sleep. She looked at me like she had caught me sneaking out as a teenager. "Claire," she sighed, rubbing her eyes. "It's the middle of the night. What are you doing?" I hesitated, then turned the laptop toward her. "I can't stop thinking about it, Mom. There's no Daniel anywhere in our records. Nothing. It's like he was erased." Her expression tightened. For a moment, she just stood there, lips pressed thin, as though debating whether to say what was on her mind. Then she crossed the room and sat down across from me. "You think your grandfather was hiding something," she said flatly. "I don't think." "I know," I whispered. Mom stayed at her hands, twisting her wedding band. "Your grandfather, he was a good man, Claire. But he was also private. There were things he never talked about, especially from his time in the service. Maybe Daniel was connected to that. But why would he say tell them the truth?" I counted, tapping the letter with my finger. Why keep it hidden behind a desk panel? That's not just privacy, Mom. That's shame. Or fear. Her eyes flickered, and I saw it, just for a second. A crack in her certainty. "I don't know," she admitted softly. The conversation left me restless. I went to bed but tossed and turned, my dreams filled with faceless men calling out a name I couldn't place. By the time the morning sun streamed through the curtains, my determination had only hardened. I needed answers. The next day, I drove into town. The Mitchell name was well known here. My grandfather had lived in the farmhouse his whole life. The local library, small but proud, kept decades of records. I walked through the heavy glass doors, greeted by the familiar scent of paper and dust. Mrs. Kendall, the librarian, recognized me instantly. "Claire Mitchell," she said warmly, adjusting her glasses. "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. He was always so kind to me when I was a girl." "Thank you," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something family-related. Do you keep old town records? Like newspapers, registries, that sort of thing?" Her eyes brightened. "Of course. What are you looking for?" I hesitated before saying it out loud. A man named Daniel. Someone who might have known my grandfather. The name hung in the air, strange and foreign, like it didn't belong in the quiet room filled with history. Mrs. Kendall led me to the archives in the basement. She showed me the microfilm machines, the stacks of old directories. "Take your time," she said. "Sometimes the past only shows itself if you're patient." Hours passed. My eyes blurred as I scrolled through reel after reel of yellowed newspaper clippings. Weddings, births, war announcements, obituaries, faces and names blurred together, but none of them were Daniel. Just when I was about to give up, a headline caught my eye: "Local soldier missing in action, 1944. I leaned closer, my heart hammering. The article was brief, only a few lines, but the name leapt off the page. Private Daniel Harper, reported missing during operations in France. Last seen alongside Sergeant Thomas Mitchell. My breath caught. My grandfather. He had been there. With him. I printed the article, my hand shaking as I folded the thin sheet of paper into my bag. For the first time, Daniel wasn't just a shadow. He was real. Flesh and blood. A soldier. And he had disappeared alongside my grandfather. The question now burned brighter than ever: why had my grandfather never spoken his name aloud? That evening, I brought the article home. Michael was in the living room, flipping channels with the volume too high, but I didn't waste time. I dropped the paper in front of him. "Read it," I said firmly. He scanned the words, his brow furrowing. "Missing in action. Wait, Grandpa never mentioned this." "Exactly," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why not? Why bury his name behind a desk for 50 years? Michael leaned back, his jaw tightening. Maybe Grandpa felt guilty. Maybe he thought it was his fault Daniel didn't come home. The possibility hung heavy between us. Guilt, regret, secrets too painful to share. But as I looked down at the letter again, at the line about telling the truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just guilt. There was more. Something deeper. Something my grandfather had fought to keep hidden until the day he died. And now, whether I was ready or not, that truth had fallen into my hands. The article lay on the table between Michael and me, its ink still faintly smudging my fingertips. I couldn't look away from Daniel's name, even though I'd read it a dozen times already. It wasn't just the letters or the story they carried. It was the quiet thrum beneath them, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. That night, long after Michael had gone to bed, I stayed in the living room. The house seemed to hum with memory, as if the walls themselves knew what I didn't. Shadows stretched long and deep, curling around the furniture, whispering things I couldn't quite hear. I picked up the letter again, reading my grandfather's shaky words, then set it beside the article. Two artifacts, one hidden away for decades, the other buried in archives. Both connected by a single man whose ghost had somehow stepped into my life. Tell them the truth. Those words weren't meant for silence. They were meant for me. I decided I had to return to the farmhouse. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove out along the familiar dirt road. The fields on either side were wild now, the crops long gone, but the old house stood solid against the gray sky, weathered but proud. Parking in the gravel drive, I stepped out and felt the crunch of stones beneath my boots, the smell of damp earth clinging to the air. Unlocking the door, I entered a space frozen in time. The same creaking floorboards, the same faint scent of tobacco and cedar. Sunlight filtered weakly through lace curtains, painting the living room in pale patterns. I walked upstairs first. The bedrooms hadn't changed since childhood. Doilies on the dressers, photographs in oval frames, heavy quilts folded neatly. But something tugged me toward the study again. The place where I'd first found the letter. The desk waited like an old sentinel. I pulled the chair back, lowered myself, and let my hands drift across the worn surface. My grandfather had sat here countless nights, pen in hand, the lamp casting a golden circle on the paper. What had he been thinking then? What secrets had weighed on his shoulders? As if guided, I opened the drawers again, running my fingers along their edges. No new panels revealed themselves, but when I bent lower, a faint scratch on the wood caught my attention. It wasn't random. It looked deliberate. Kneeling down, I traced it with my fingertip. Letters. Initials. D.H. Daniel Harper. I froze. Breath caught in my chest. The wood was worn smooth, but the carving had been etched deep, like a reminder meant to endure. My grandfather had marked it. He hadn't erased Daniel. He'd carried him here, right into the fabric of his home. The discovery sent a shiver through me. I pressed my palm flat against the carving, as though touching it might bridge the decades. For a moment, the silence in the room seemed to stir, like a sigh, a breath too faint to belong to me. That night, I stayed in the farmhouse. The place was cold, the heater unreliable, but I lit a fire in the old brick hearth and wrapped myself in one of my grandmother's quilts. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but the quiet pressed in too heavily. At some point, I dozed off in the armchair. When I woke, it was to the sound of faint voices. Not clear, not loud, just murmurs, like conversations through a wall. My heart thudded. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to drift from upstairs, from the study. I told myself it was the wind through the eaves. But something about it felt different, deliberate. Gathering my courage, I crept up the stairs, the quilt still wrapped around my shoulders. The door to the study was ajar, shadows stretching into the hallway. I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, still, and yet, I could swear the air carried a faint trace of smoke, as though a cigarette had just been put out. My grandfather's scent. I stood frozen, the hairs on my arms rising. Whispers, initials, hidden letters. None of this felt random anymore. It felt like a thread pulling me deeper, as though my grandfather himself wanted me to keep going. The next morning, I called Mrs. Kendall at the library. Did Daniel Harper have family? I asked, my voice tight. She promised to look into it and called back within an hour. I found something. His parents lived on the outskirts of town during the war years. They lost touch after he went missing. The house is still standing, though abandoned now. A chill ran down my spine. By noon, I was parked outside the Harper property. The house was small, sagging under the weight of neglect, its shutters hanging loose, the paint peeled to gray. The yard was overgrown, branches clawing at the windows like desperate hands. I pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with dust, motes swirling in shafts of light. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning, but I pressed on. The living room was bare except for a few broken chairs and a collapsed bookshelf. In the corner, though, stood a trunk, rusted, dented, but intact. My pulse quickened. It took effort, but I pried it open. Inside were folded uniforms, photographs yellowed with age, and a stack of letters bound with twine. I lifted one carefully, the paper brittle beneath my fingers. The handwriting was neat, elegant, addressed to dearest mother and father. They were from Daniel. I sat cross-legged on the floor, reading line after line. His words painted vivid pictures of battles, comrades, the longing for home. But more than that, he spoke often of Tommy, my grandfather. Tommy watches over me like a brother. Tell Tommy thank you for saving me when I couldn't move. I wouldn't be here without him. Each line struck me harder, my throat tightening with emotion. These weren't whispers anymore. They were voices from the past, speaking clearly, insisting their story be heard. The final letter in the stack was different. Dated just weeks before he vanished, it ended abruptly. If something happens, tell Tommy, he knows. The ink smudged as though the writer's hand had trembled. I pressed the paper to my chest, tears stinging my eyes. Daniel hadn't just been a comrade. He'd trusted my grandfather with something enormous, something he hadn't even written down. And whatever it was, my grandfather had carried it alone, all these years, until the weight of it drove him to leave behind that one desperate plea: tell them the truth. I drove back to the farmhouse as dusk fell, the letters beside me on the seat. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, but my mind was alive with voices. Whispers no longer buried. Whispers demanding to be answered. And I knew this was only the beginning. The farmhouse lights glowed faintly as I pulled into the drive, the old porch lamp flickering against the deepening night. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the letters on the passenger seat. Their presence felt alive, as though Daniel himself rode beside me, urging me forward. When I finally stepped out, the chill hit hard, carrying the sharp scent of rain. I tucked the letters under my arm and hurried inside, shutting the door firmly behind me. For a moment I leaned against it, breathing in the silence. But silence wasn't what I felt. The house had changed. It wasn't louder, not exactly, but the air carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Like a story staring awake, no longer content to stay buried. I placed the letters on the desk in the study, laying them carefully over the carved initials. The fire I'd left earlier had died down, embers glowing faintly. I crouched and coaxed the flames back, watching sparks catch and spread until warmth filled the room again. Sitting back in the chair, I opened one of Daniel's letters. His words seemed to rise from the page, more vivid than before, as though they wanted to be spoken aloud. So I did. My voice was unsteady at first, but the rhythm of his sentences gave me courage. Tommy watches over me like a brother. The words lingered in the room, carrying weight beyond my own voice. I read another line. If something happens, tell Tommy, he knows. The moment the words left my lips, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun, heart pounding, but the doorway was empty. The house was still, and yet, I knew it wasn't just me here anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the upstairs bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the wind rattled branches against the windows. My mind kept cycling the same questions. What did my grandfather know? Why had he hidden Daniel's existence? And what was it that Daniel believed only Tommy understood? At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, it was to the sound of someone humming. A low, steady tune carried through the walls. I sat up, pulse racing. The sound came from downstairs, near the study. I crept down, every step careful, the quilt wrapped tightly around me. The study door was open, lamplight spilling faintly. Inside, the letters lay scattered, though I had left them neatly stacked. The chair was turned slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. The humming had stopped. My breath caught. I stood frozen, then whispered into the stillness. Grandpa. No answer, only the fire crackling low in the grate. But when I moved closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Another letter, wedged between two books on the shelf. Its envelope was yellowed, the flap sealed with brittle glue. My hands shook as I pulled it free. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a single word on the front. Truth. I sat at the desk, staring at it for what felt like forever. Finally, I broke the seal and unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was my grandfather's, unmistakable in its shaky loops. Daniel's secret is not mine alone. But if you've found this, you must be ready. The truth cannot stay silent forever. No details, no explanations, just that. Frustration burned through me. I slammed the letter down, tears of anger stinging my eyes. Why had he left fragments instead of answers? Why the riddles, the whispers, the half-told stories? I stood, pacing the room, my fists tight at my sides. "If you wanted me to know," I muttered aloud, "then why didn't you just say it?" The words echoed back at me, and then the fire flared. Not wildly, not dangerously, but in a sudden burst, flames rising higher as if in response. The letters fluttered from the desk, drifting toward the floor. I caught one before it landed, clutching it to my chest. That was the moment I stopped doubting. This wasn't coincidence. This was alive. The following day, I drove into town and visited the church. Old Reverend Collins had known my grandfather for decades, though age had slowed his memory. Still, when I asked about Daniel Harper, a flicker crossed his face. He leaned closer, his voice low. They were inseparable, you know. Not just comrades. They had an understanding. Something the rest of us couldn't touch. Whatever they carried back from that war, it bound them. "What do you mean?" I pressed, but the Reverend only shook his head, weary eyes clouded. "Some truths aren't spoken in daylight." His words followed me all the way back to the farmhouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone who had known the truth had chosen silence, and that silence had grown so heavy it now pressed against me from all sides. That evening, as the sun sank and shadows stretched long, I sat in the study once more. I spread out every letter, every scrap of evidence, as if arranging them might form a picture. Daniel's words, my grandfather's plea, the carved initials, the sealed envelope marked truth. Piece by piece, a story began to take shape, not complete, but undeniable. Daniel had entrusted something to my grandfather. Not just trust, not just gratitude, but a secret. A secret my grandfather had carried across years, across oceans of silence. A secret he had nearly taken to his grave, until his guilt demanded he leave a trail for me to follow. And now, that secret was no longer content to stay hidden, because every flicker of flame, every whisper in the night, every uncanny shift in the air told me the same thing. The truth was alive. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the fire. My reflection glimmered faintly in the glass of the framed photographs on the mantel. My grandfather in uniform, smiling stiffly, his hand resting on another soldier's shoulder. I looked closer. The other man. I had seen his face before, in the article, in the photographs tucked inside Daniel's trunk. Daniel Harper. I whispered his name aloud. And in that instant, the photograph slipped from the mantel, landing face down on the floor. I stayed at it, pulse racing. My hand trembled as I picked it up again. The secret wasn't just memory anymore. It was here. It was moving. The photograph trembled in my grip, my fingertips smudging the glass as though it carried heat of its own. Daniel's face stared back at me, steadfast, familiar, haunting. I set the frame gently on the desk, but the weight of it lingered in my chest, heavy as stone. The house seemed to breathe with me, each inhale drawn into its walls, each exhale stirring the air around me. I whispered again, softer this time, Daniel Harper. The fire crackled, sending a burst of sparks into the hearth. I flinched, then stilled. Somewhere deep inside, I understood. This was not coincidence. This was permission. I reached for the letters once more, spreading them across the desk like scattered puzzle pieces. My hands moved quickly, desperate now, eyes devouring the words. Every line, every hurried sentence, every smudge of ink, together they formed something whole. And then I saw it. In one of the final letters, Daniel had written a phrase that until now I had overlooked. Tommy carries what I could not. My heart slammed against my ribs. My grandfather's name, his real name, was Thomas. I staggered back, the room spinning, tears springing hot and sudden. All at once the years of silence, the late-night stares, the way Grandpa's hand sometimes trembled when the radio played war songs. It all made sense. He hadn't been silent because he forgot. He had been silent because he remembered too much. I sank into the chair, clutching the letter, and the truth rose like a tide I could no longer hold back. The A shifted. I heard it then, a voice, faint as breath against glass. Clay. I bolted upright, eyes darting around the room. The study was empty. My pulse hammered. The voice came again, steadier now. Not imagined. Not a trick of exhaustion. Claire, he loved him. The fire dimmed, its glow softening to embers, and I swore I felt a presence at my back. I turned slowly, every hair on my arms rising. And there, by the window, stood a figure. Not solid, not fully formed, but outlined in silver light. The suggestion of a man in uniform, his shoulders broad, his face half-shadowed. Daniel Harper. I couldn't speak. My lips moved soundlessly, my breath frozen. He didn't step closer, didn't threaten. He only watched, his eyes carrying centuries of silence. Then he lifted his hand, not pointing outward, but toward the desk, toward the letters. The message was clear. Keep reading. And then, as suddenly as he appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the faint imprint of his presence in the air. Shaking, I turned back to the desk. My fingers found the last letter, dated weeks before Daniel's disappearance. The words tore through me. Tommy is the only one who knows the truth. If history writes me wrong, if they bury my name, remember this. I never left him. Not in the trenches, not in the silence, not even when the world turned its back. He was my family. He was my heart. My chest tightened, a sob breaking loose before I could stop it. I pressed the paper against my lips, eyes blurring. The truth was here, written plain. Not in riddles, not in whispers. Clear, unflinching. Daniel hadn't just been my grandfather's friend. He had been his everything. The house seemed to sigh with me, as though the walls themselves had waited decades for the words to be spoken aloud. I whispered into the quiet, "You loved him." And in that moment, I understood the carving on the desk, the secrecy, the long nights of silence. My grandfather had carried a love the world would never have allowed him to name. Daniel's disappearance hadn't been a mere footnote of war. It had been the wound that never healed. And I, unknowingly, had become the keeper of their truth. I closed my eyes, pressing my palms to the desk. "Grandpa," I said softly, "I know now. I know." For the first time in weeks, the house felt lighter. The tension in the walls loosened, the heaviness in the air easing into something gentler, almost tender. The fire steadied, no longer flaring in protest, no longer threatening. Just warm, steady flame. I leaned back in the chair, exhausted, but not broken. The truth no longer felt like a weight to crush me. It was a gift, handed across generations, asking only to be carried forward with dignity. A sudden knock startled me. Sharp, urgent, rattling the front door. I froze, wiping quickly at my face. No one came here unannounced. Not this late. I opened the door to find Reverend Collins standing on the porch, breathless, his coat dusted with rain. His old eyes searched mine with urgency. "You found it, didn't you?" he said without preamble. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "The truth," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Tommy's truth." My throat closed. I stepped aside, letting him in. He lowered himself heavily into a chair by the fire, his hands trembling as they stretched toward the warmth. "I was the last one left who knew," he admitted. "I promised your grandfather I'd never speak unless you discovered it yourself. He wanted you to choose, to carry it or to let it rest." I swallowed hard, sitting opposite him. "Why me?" Collins met my eyes, and in them I saw the weight of decades. "Because you listen. Because you hear what others ignore. He trusted you would not turn away." The fire popped, sending sparks dancing, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not even sorrow. Resolve. The secret was no longer hidden. The silence had been broken. I reached for the letters one final time, gathering them into a careful stack. My grandfather's handwriting, Daniel's ink, the words they never spoke aloud but left for me to find. The final truth wasn't simply about love. It was about courage, the courage to carry a story the world once forced into silence. I looked at Reverend Collins, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I won't let it fade," I said. And for the first time, I felt the house exhale fully. The embers glowed brighter, not in warning, but in peace. The truth had come alive, and now, at last, it was free.